you are panelists. Peter and I have flipped a coin, and I'm the one who goes first. Well, thank you all for coming, and I just want to congratulate you on this wonderful 65th anniversary exhibit. I think it's marvelous to combine the past with the present and the future. And it's all here under this roof this evening. Well, we are told that 6 degrees of separation connect us to those of our time. There are also historical degrees of separation by which we are linked to those from the past. For me, the artist and preservationist Mildred Burrage was such a connection through her vivid memories of such notable Maine figures as her father Henry Burrage's friend, Joshua Chamberlain. Mildred's first encounter with the famed Civil War general and Bowdoin College president took place at 6 years old in 1896 when she was with her father on a train returning to Portland from a visit with her grandfather in Bangor. When Chamberlain boarded the train in Brunswick, he joined Burrage in conversation as Mildred looked on in awe and fascination. As the train arrived in Portland's Union Station, Chamberlain drew a booklet about himself from his valise, signed and dated at 1896, and handed it to Mildred as a souvenir. More than 80 years later, she told me this story as she passed the Chamberlain book on to me. Got to change glasses here. That's better. I first met Mildred Burrage in the summer of 1968 when I was 20 and she was 78. While nearly 60 years separated us in age, we shared a passion for Maine history. That year, I was in my 4th season as a summer reporter for the Portland newspapers. Eddie Fitzpatrick, the feature editor of the Maine Sunday Telegram, asked me to write a series of articles about the 3 most well-preserved communities in Maine. My selection of Wiscasset, Castine, and Paris Hill was made in consultation with Francis O'Brien of Portland, the Dean of Maine Antiquarian Booksellers, who was a close friend and mentor. So broad were Francis's contacts throughout the state that he could recommend knowledgeable individuals for me to interview in all 3 communities. The artist Mildred Burrage and her sister jewelry maker Madeline Burrage topped the list for Wiscasset. On a warm August morning, Mildred Burrage ushered me into the front parlor of the Federal Period house that she shared with her sister on Lee Street in Wiscasset. Mildred quickly proved to be a young reporter's dream, requiring little prompting as she traced Wiscasset's historical development and the reasons for its preservation as Maine's prettiest village in the 20th century. For the next 2 hours, my pen raced across the paper as I tried to take notes. As I left, I remarked on the crossed swords and the sash that hung above the arch between the front and back walls. Mildred explained that they had belonged to her father, Major Henry S. Burrage, who had served in the 26th Massachusetts Regiment during the Civil War. And then bear in mind, in 1968, the Civil War was already 100 years past. His wartime experiences included seeing Abraham Lincoln on 3 occasions and being held in a captive in the Confederate prison in Richmond, Libby Prison. By the time my Wiscasset article was published in September 1968, I had started my junior year at Colby. The following spring of 1969, the Maine Historical Society was engaged in a contentious election for president, with one candidate defending the established order and the other seeking to reform the bylaws to bring the organization into the 20th century. Mildred Burrage and I were on the side of the reformers, whose candidate lost by 10 votes. As I left the Society's headquarters after the vote, Mildred saw that I was visibly upset. In her characteristically determined spirit, she sought to comfort me by declaring, "Now don't worry, we'll just outlive them." Mildred's prophecy proved true, for 8 years later, in 1977, I was elected president of the Maine Historical Society at the age of 29, come the revolution. In the spring of 1969, Mildred Burrage learned that I would be traveling to Europe that summer. She contacted me to say that she needed help to open the properties of the Lincoln County Cultural and Historical Association, the Powellboro Courthouse, the old jail, and the jailer's house, and of course, as we well know, all historic properties that she was instrumental in preserving. For 3 weeks of work in Dresden and Wiscasset, I would receive $250 that I could apply to my European trip. Those 3 weeks in June 1969 provided me with the opportunity to get to know the Burrage sisters. Assisting Mildred was an intense experience because of the energetic way in which she approached every project, whether it was mounting an exhibit or creating an abstract painting. While she had little time for lunch, I was rewarded each evening with a delicious dinner prepared by Madeline, an accomplished cook who had attended Fanny Farmer's Boston Cooking School in her youth. Served on TV trays in the front parlor, these meals provided a chance for the sisters to regale their young guest with their stories of their past. As the evening progressed, the room became alive with memories of their father's friend, Joshua Chamberlain, American Impressionist painters in France before World War I, novelists Booth Tarkington and Kenneth Roberts, and art historian Erwin Panofsky. Mildred spoke in emphatic, declarative sentences and a cultivated accent, while Madeline laced her conversation with her dry humor and her frequent laughter. When my 3 memorable weeks in Lincoln County ended, Mildred Burrage lent me her 1909 Baedeker Guide to Paris, saying that while it was 60 years old, the city probably hadn't changed that much since she was there before World War I. When I came back from Europe in summer of 1969 for my senior year at Colby, I dutifully returned the book. Years later, I found it while helping to settle her estate, and it remains one of my treasured possessions. During my final year at Colby, I took a senior seminar in art history taught by my departmental chairman, Professor James Carpenter. One of my assignments was to interview an artist and report my findings. This led to my tape recording a long interview with Mildred Burrage about her 60-year career as an artist. She shared with me her experiences as a young woman from Maine in France from 1909 to 1914. Her recollections included friendships with American Impressionist painters and their families, particularly in Giverny, and there a chance meeting with Monet, exhibitions of Picasso and Matisse in Paris, a visit to Gertrude Stein's salon, and the outbreak of World War I in Europe. She described her discovery of abstract art in New York during World War II and how it transformed her work. Finally, she discussed her friendships with Maine artists such as Marguerite and William Zorak. And of course, her friendship with Marguerite went back to her days when they were both in Paris around 1910. She had actually known Marguerite Thompson then, later Marguerite Zorak. My graduation from Colby in June 1970 was followed by 2.5 years of graduate school at Boston University. When I returned to Maine in 1973 to work for the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, I resumed my visits with the Burrage sisters. Once again, I spent hours in their company, reliving the events of their colorful lives. Mildred was also keenly interested in discussing the state's current cultural scene. During one of these visits, she looked me squarely in the face and remarked that if I were going to live in Maine, the only way to avoid becoming provincial here was to read the Sunday edition of the New York Times each week. And I took this advice to heart and have not missed an issue in 50 years. I really don't dare to. Madeline Burrage died in 1976. Mildred Burrage remained active as an artist until she entered a nursing home after suffering a stroke at the age of 90 in 1980. I visited her several times there during the last 3 years of her life. During one of our conversations, she declared, "Here I am after all these years, still living on my grandfather's stick money." Her reference was to her mother's father, Moses Giddings of Bangor, who had amassed a fortune in the lumber trade during the mid-19th century. To the end of her life, Mildred Burrage maintained an active interest in Maine's history and culture. Her father, as we've already heard, Henry Burrage, had been Maine's first state historian, and I trust that she would be pleased that I have served in that position since 2004. I often reflect upon how influential Mildred was in shaping my sense of the state's history. During our 15-year friendship, she provided a living link to figures and events of distant times. And now I want to just quote from Mildred herself in a document that I found recently in some of her papers. In 1951, Dr. Julius Seeley Bixler of Colby, who was deeply committed to the arts at Colby, he founded the Arts and Music Department shortly after he came in 1942. He turned to Mildred for ideas about future planning for Colby, both for art curriculum and also for the hope of a new museum, which of course was realized in 1959. And true to Mildred's form, she not only gave him a report about what should happen at Colby, but she created a remarkable document envisioning the current and future state of the arts in Maine. And one of the poignant quotes from that is as follows: "I had lived through 2 world wars. No peace was in sight. What we had done to hold on to civilization, was it leaving us? After all, what is civilization but the byproduct of man's creative thought as it shapes his life and the things he plans and does? What is peace but a byproduct of a satisfactory creative adjustment to life where activities are used to build up and not to tear down? Where had we gone astray? I came back to Maine after the war thinking that perhaps in the arts, the creative way of life, lay a way to peace that had never been fully explored. How to make that come clear, to bring it into our daily lives. I looked at all endeavors in the arts with a fresh eye." Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and looking at the show, it's really a wonderful tribute to what's been going on in this area. I would like to share my thoughts on Mildred Burrage and the Maine Art Gallery. And I would like to say that it's really a pleasure to do this again with Earle. And I'd like to thank the Maine Art Gallery trustees and all of the people that worked so hard to put this show on called Generations. I believe the first time I met you, Earle, was at Mildred Burrage's house on Lee Street, and it was perhaps 1978. And she had invited us over for tea and conversation, and she had the largest Indian brass platter I had ever seen with a mound of macadamia nuts on it. And that was the refreshments. But it was like her to do something creative about everything. We had a wonderful time, and over the years, Earle and I, our paths have crisscrossed for the many years, and I'm honored to be with you once again to have this discussion. I wrote down some of my thoughts because I didn't want to forget all the things I wanted to share with you. As you all know, as we go through life, we're influenced very much by people that tell us things or mentor us, and it seems that many of the things